This is the Life at Work Conference podcast, a production of City Bible Forum. Real workers, wrestling with real workplace issues. With your host, Life at Work National Manager, Andrew Laird.
Welcome to the Life at Work Conference podcast. We're actually taking a break this week from our normal pattern to bring you this bonus episode. Back in November, in episode 3, we interviewed author, speaker and academic Cara Martin. It was a really fantastic chat, and Cara had so many pearls of wisdom and practical advice, so much so we couldn't actually fit it all in our normal episode. But rather than you missing out, we thought let's bundle up a portion we couldn't fit in and release it as a bonus episode. So here it is. In that episode, Cara shared her thinking on workship, how work and worship should be connected. But in this section we're going to play for you now, I asked her to tell us a bit more about how work and worship have been brought together throughout church history. While her term workship is a fresh way of thinking about it, Cara explains some creative ways the early church thought about work as worship and some implications that they might have for us and church life today. So here's Cara.
In the early church, there seems to be this real linking of work and worship. So there were in some places in Venice that were excavated, there were these mosaics of workplace. And so at first people, the archaeologists, thought that these places were just ordinary workplaces or something. But then they had evidence that they were actually places of worship. So you had early churches where the images around the wall were images of workplaces. And I think that was to actually remind people that their faith and work should be linked. But you see it in the early church practices as well. So for their communion, it was actually a meal, and people would bring their work to church to have a meal together. So the baker would bring the bread, and the person who grew grapes would bring fruit, and someone would bring other elements. The potter would bring some bowls and so on to eat from. So the actual meal at the table where people remembered Jesus would actually be literally the work of people's hands being brought and offered to God. So there was this intrinsic link, and people would bring other aspects of their working to the church, and they might either be used in worship itself, or it might be used to pass out to poor people, or all other things. So there was this intrinsic link. People would come to the church and they would offer things. Then, unfortunately, I think what we have is a tale of Greek philosophy interrupting our understanding of these things. So this idea that work is something that God would value is something that Greek philosophy would reject. And there's this separation between body and spirit, or body and soul, which I think has permeated, such that gradually over time, the church seems to have separated and compartmentalized work and faith. There was a correction during the Reformation. There was a correction to that idea, and what we saw there was an understanding again of vocation, not just as something you did within a church context or a monk, but actually something you did in everyday life. So Martin Luther famously said that the rustic labourer in the field and the woman going about her household tasks is doing something just as worthy of God as a monk or a priest doing their work. And so that really elevated it again. And yet again, I feel like over the last couple of centuries, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, we've again seen this compartmentalization, which has meant now that when we go to church, it's almost as if what we do doesn't matter. So I had someone just on Saturday say to me that she was called by her minister to ask her how she's going. And she replied about what was happening in her home life and what was happening in her small group, but not once did she even think of mentioning her work. And yet she has this incredibly significant public service job. But there was something that stopped her, and she was wondering about it. And she thought, she didn't know whether it was, she didn't think that her minister would be interested in it, but it just never occurred to her, this connection between her work, which is such a huge part of her life, and the minister asking her how she was going. And I think that disconnection is real for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Cara Martin there outlining some fascinating ways the early church brought work and worship together and suggesting some ways we could learn from them for our church life today. Well, I hope you enjoyed that extra clip from Cara there. And if you haven't already, make sure you catch the full episode with her, episode 3 in this podcast series. But next week, we return to our normal schedule. Until then, I'm Andrew Laird, and you've been listening to the Life at Work Conference podcast.
The Life at Work Conference podcast is produced by City Bible Forum. To find out more and register for the conference, go to citybibleforum.org/lifeatworkconference.